We are today with Jonathan Golslag. You already know him with his this year panels and also with the last year panels and his publications. Quite unusual talk now. I don't know whether Jonathan will be very open with you, because he told me several things about himself, changes in his life. He knows his studies, his articles about China, and he will tell about China much, and more we expect from him to tell us about Ukraine. I would like to introduce his with some reminiscences on his book that Europe lost the game to China because Europe did not include in its considerations the way which China works with its counterparts. And Europe was inventive, Europe was innovative, but Europe was not enough protective. We know that KIEF International Economic Forum has 3 slogans this year: innovation, protectionism, and substitute of imports. Very strange mix, we think, but as of Jonathan's works, not very strange, because Europe, as again I would like to repeat, lost the game because it was the protectionism was not included. From my side, my last opinions, which I try to share with Jonathan, is that it's a time of new protectionism for Ukraine, and new protectionism includes not only old protectionism, which we know, but also the expansionism. And I would like you to welcome Jonathan Golsslag here with his insights. He needs half an hour of his speech. I don't know whether you would be interested to hear the questions, because we have a quite sophisticated audience today, and I would like you to leave the guys the opportunity to ask you and to hear live answers. So, welcome.
I'm going to use this, and I would like to stand, if that's okay, to talk. I don't like to give a presentation.
If I can sit.
What? You can sit, that's fine. First of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some insights about China and the impact of China's rise on European and Ukrainian economies and societies. As you all understand, the situation is a bit complicated. Not only in Ukraine, but also in the rest of the European Union, we are faced still with very high levels of unemployment. We are still faced with, do I need a microphone, or does my voice read?
Translation.
Translation, okay. Then I will use the microphone. So we are faced with unemployment, we are faced still with high levels of economic uncertainty, and I think we are faced with, I would say, a general crisis of confidence in this part of the world. We know that we had a great past, but we don't know how to shape the future. And if anything basically cripples a society, and especially if anything cripples the young generation, it is the ability to shape and define goals and objectives for the future. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the world at large has arrived at a very, very difficult situation, that the world is sort of stuck in a developmental bottleneck, of which the China rise is only one little part. I think it doesn't make sense to talk about China, 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 if we don't take into consideration some of the broader evolutions that characterize the world economy. And I think to begin with, it's all about this chart. This chart visualizes some of the economic trends and evolutions in the EU 28 countries. Why do I think this chart is very interesting and important? First of all, because it gives us two perspectives of the economic evolutions. What we cheer about very often in forums like this, but also in the Davos World Economic Forum, is the green curve, and you don't really see it on the screen, so I will just point at it, is the green curve and the dark blue curve. So if you discuss about growth and resilience, then you have all these business people and these economists saying, well, recovery of the world is very impressive. We're doing well. We are moving from a period of stagnation and recession to new growth. Container traffic is up, also for Ukraine. If you look at containerized trade in Ukraine via railway, via ships, you get more and more of that. GDP growth nominally, so production, also up. But then when it comes to translating trade and GDP in what affects our daily lives the most, our ability to spend our income, and preferably also income adjusted to inflation. If we look at private sector employment, the curves are flat, right? So on the one hand, more trade, more globalization, more production, but on the other hand, people ask, what's in it for me? I haven't seen my income growing in the last 8 years. I'm really struggling to find a good job in the private sector. So there is this big gap between, on the one hand, these steep upward curves related to globalization and production, and on the other hand, what people at the end of the day derive as benefits from that. Also, I think very interesting for Europe, and I think that also applies to Ukraine, is the confidence of companies in the future. And I think the best indicator of that is not just entrepreneurial confidence indexes, but it's their willingness to invest. If companies invest in new infrastructure, in new machines, in new software, I think that is the best indicator of their confidence in an economic future. But what do we see for the European Union? That investment levels of the private sector have dropped, are still way below the beginning of the Eurozone crisis. So this is a very contradictory situation. If we want, we can be very optimistic. As long as we look at trade and the volumes of containers and the output of factories, it's fine. But if we define what is in it for the people in terms of well-being, in terms of employment, in terms of purchasing power, it's much more complicated. And there is another dimension to it. That is our ability to convert growth in well-being. Like, growing in the end is not about just producing things. It's not just about making as many chairs as possible. It's not about making as many computers as possible. Growth and development and progress is also about happiness. It's also about being able to work in dignity. It's about having fun work, like not kind of brain-killing work, work that is really encouraging, work that rewards creativity. But what we then see in European countries is that a large part of people feels that work is not gratifying, that work is not fun, that work is not interesting. So you have Europeans working harder and harder and harder, but work is getting more and more boring, is getting more and more stressful, is encouraging less and less entrepreneurship. So that's another thing to take into the equation. More trade, more globalization, less income, less increases in terms of private sector employment. And if we look at the quality of jobs, very, very low. Consider, for instance, Germany. We all look at Germany as the big miracle. And in some way it is. Like, it's the industrial powerhouse of Europe. But if you look at the happiness and the well-being of Germans, it's very low. Like, a lot of these Germans have to combine 2 jobs to make ends meet. A lot of these Germans have to work in factories where work is not so interesting at all. So that's, I think, a third evolution, that is less and less well-being out of growth. One good example for me, and I keep presenting that, is Northern Holland. Northern Holland around Amsterdam is one of the richest regions on earth, right? If you have had the opportunity to travel to Amsterdam, like, it's a beautiful place to live. But what do we even see in Amsterdam, as this quite chunky table shows? No increase, hardly not, in private sector employment with high satisfaction. So if even the richest region on earth, more or less, is not able to create quality jobs in the private sector, we have a problem. This is a global phenomenon, not only confined to Europe. It's something that we see in the United States. It's something that we see in South Korea and China as well. Like, we marvel as much at China as we marvel at Germany. We all want to be part of the China success story. We have heard to the entrepreneurs here this morning and yesterday, we have to work with China, we have to learn from the China experience. And South Korea, for instance. But again, what happens? Like, South Korea is a society inching close to a collective depression. Like, you have growth, but the society in South Korea is very unhappy. China too, grow, grow, grow. These big cities with all the skyscrapers, but the people living and working in these skyscrapers are unhappy. Yes, they have jobs today. Yes, the income is going up, but work is dull, stressful, and just not gratifying. And this situation, and there I move to the core question that was asked towards my presentation, this situation leads countries like China, but not exclusively China, to push forward with an economic policy that is very, very aggressive. Like, it seems as if governments are more and more under pressure to get their part of the cake, to secure more jobs, secure more income, and I think this makes particularly a big country like China very aggressive. So what we see in the world is the emerging, as Mr. Pachenko indicated in the introduction, of new power politics. Countries, and also big countries, are under tremendous pressure to deliver growth, jobs, income, and so forth. We see, for instance, the United States re-entrenching. We see Donald Trump shouting, "Buy in America, American companies first." We see Trump saying we have to become less dependent on European imports, on German imports. You have the Chinese saying, buy in China, make it in China. Chinese pushing for industrial policy. You have European countries now trying to push for their visions for future industries. So this is leading to an economic battle between the main powers. Like, if the idea was in the 90s still, and let's say 10 years ago, that we would move towards a flat world, as Friedman said it, a world order in which borders would be erased by the forces of globalization, we see the refragmentation. States and governments are back in the forefront to defend and advance their industrial interests. And what Mr. Pachenko said is very true. It's not just about protectionism anymore. It's not just about sort of keeping industries at home. It's also about breaking open foreign markets. And that's, as we will see in a few seconds, the essence of the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road that China is pushing for. So the question is, of course, from the viewpoint of our societies and Ukraine in particular, what's the future going to bring? How should we position ourselves in a world order that is fragmented? And how should we go about this kind of model of growth that relatively, generates relatively at least less and less opportunities for the people? And then again, as I said, a lot of entrepreneurs and politicians and also academics often look at China as the savior. China is going to save us, right? We're going to get Chinese investment, so we will be able to grow. We're going to trade with China, so we will be able to do better. We want Chinese companies to invest in our ports. We want Chinese companies to do our agriculture. We want to learn Chinese, which of course is nice. We want to go to China. But is that really appropriate? Is the future of Ukraine, is your future as young Ukrainian citizens, is it really going to be shaped in China? To answer that question, I think it is very important, first of all, to try to understand what China's economy is all about. What is China's economy all about? And is China's economy also so solid as we often reckon it to be? Is China indeed the powerhouse of the world? I think to grasp fully what China is about, we have to go back to a very critical remark that Premier Wen Jiabao made in 2006. Then he went into the open and said, our economy is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. In other ways, we are stuck. We invest too much, and we invest too much in polluting industries, and we depend too much on export. It was at that time that the Chinese government promised, we are going to do differently. Instead of relying on investment, we shift to domestic consumption, and instead of relying on exports, also we make the domestic economy stronger. But if we look at this chart again, only conclusion is that Chinese government failed and continue to fail miserably in rebalancing the Chinese economy. Like its dependence on investment, the solid blue curve, has gone up. The importance of household consumption has continued to go down. So there has not been any rebalancing in China. And this is kind of peculiar. Like we usually look at the People's Republic of China and its government as the only government that can deliver, right? It is having all the power in economic affairs. So if there is one government that can basically adjust, it's China. But it has not happened. And this is kind of bizarre. But it also comes with very, very important consequences. The first consequence is that what characterizes China's foreign economic policy is a relentless, if not vicious, push for exports. China's domestic market has become less and less able to buy what Chinese companies produce, right? Of course, in absolute terms, consumption in China grows, but compared to the manufacturing output in particular, it's not enough. So China is really under pressure to export the glut of its factories. Not only to export cheap textile and shoes and steel, but increasingly also to export advanced stuff. Cars, locomotives, railway locomotives, planes, electronics, and so forth. The dependency of the manufacturing sector on exports, as this chart shows, since 2009 has again continued to go up. And as I already flagged, this is the essence of Belt and Road. The essence of Belt and Road is to rid of the overcapacity that exists in China's economy. On the one hand, it is about exporting more manufactured goods, penetrating more foreign markets, which was, I think, spelled out very well in the 2015 guiding document that different government departments issued. But it's also about exporting services. Like, for example, most of China's telecommunication network is now developed. Like, you can have 4G access everywhere, almost in big Chinese cities. Ports have been built, right? China has the biggest ports on earth. Railway infrastructure has been rolled out. So this market in China is saturated. So the Silk Road now is about supporting service providers, contractors, construction companies, telecom companies, to also break open foreign markets. And this is also what Mr. Pachenko referred to. So it's not about protectionism any longer. It's about going out. It's replacing the defense for offense, if you want. One very important instrument to support that going out and to support the Belt and Road is cash, is money, is capital. So on the one hand, what has allowed for China's rapid and stellar economic growth has been the ability of the Communist Party of China via its policy banks to lend a lot of money to national industries so that they could expand their production capacity very, very rapidly. Now we move to the stage that the government is demanding its policy banks, China Development Bank, Exim Bank, and so forth, to lend money to overseas consumers to buy Chinese goods and services. So the result is that what you see the most in China's foreign investment, so to speak, is direct investment, but especially also what makes China particular, trade credit and loans. So, for instance, in case of Ukraine, if we talk about Chinese investment in infrastructure and in ports, usually that is not foreign direct investment. Usually that is not the kind of investment that really comes with productive activity. What China does instead is to give money to the government of Ukraine and to Ukrainian companies to buy Chinese services, to hire Chinese companies to develop your ports. Now this comes with three big conditions. First, of course, you have to pay the money back, right? A loan that you get from China is not a grant. Like a loan has to be paid back, usually in a term of 5 to 10 years. Second condition is that you have to use the money to buy Chinese products. And that's a big difference with other Exim banks. Like if you go to European Exim banks, you can have credit to buy products from all kinds of countries. If you go to the Chinese Exim bank, if you get Chinese loans, you have to buy Chinese products, right? So that's a kind of economic conditionality that really confines the options for investment. A third condition is that in exchange for these loans, China demands you to open the economy, right? If China, for instance, considers giving a loan to the Ukrainian government, then it will ask you, as it has asked in 2013, we want land, right? Your industry sucks, so to speak. There is nothing much that you can offer there, so we want farmland. We want to be able to get farmland, and to be able to get farmland, we want you, Ukrainian government, to change the constitution. That's how it works. So it comes with political conditionality as well. So as a result of this kind of statecraft and export-driven economic policy, usually the impact of China's growth on partner countries is not positive. It's not positive. China is usually not catalyzing growth elsewhere, but it's undermining growth. And that's not, I'm not saying that because I hate China or because I'm a China bash, right? In fact, I admire really the way China basically conceives and pursues its economic policies, but the impact on our countries usually is not good. This table lists the impact of China on 3 indicators. First of all, for another country to boost your GDP growth requires a surplus on the current account, right? I'm not sure whether you're all economists, but if you want to allow other countries to grow, you have to allow these other countries also to have at least a balanced current account trade balance, or to have a surplus. Almost all European countries, Ukraine included, have a big trade deficit. The trade deficit of Ukraine with China is $4 to $5 billion US. Second is also, how do we compete with China in third markets? Right? It's not only about the bilateral trade, but does China allow Ukrainian companies to compete fairly in other countries? In Central Asia, for instance, or elsewhere. And then usually also we see that the impact on European countries is negative, that they are losing market share, mostly as a result of government intervention. The big support that is being churned out by its state-owned banks. Third indicator, technology transfer. Like economic cooperation can boost growth, GDP growth, if there is a positive technology transfer. But guess what? Usually the technology transfer between European countries and China goes the other way around. What we do is giving access to our technology and with the result of production capacity to relocate to China. Has also happened to Ukraine. Like Ukrainian intellectual property has proved vital in many, many, many industrial projects of China. Shipbuilding, like a lot of the gas turbines that China is now implementing on its big ships is retro-engineered from Ukrainian companies that give up their technology too easily. Aircraft, the C919, built by Comac, is full of Ukrainian know-how. It's like old Antonov engineers that, for just nothing almost, give away their know-how and their intellectual property. So again, for China to have a positive impact on Ukrainian GDP, China would have to allow a positive spillover of IPR, of technology, and this is not happening. I think Ukraine is giving away its intellectual property way too easily and way too cheaply. And then again, what you usually get for European countries is a lot of sort of China-driven activity around ports, right? Odessa as well, what we saw a few days ago was a big Costco shipping company in, fully loaded, and leaving empty. That's usually what you have. Port of Rotterdam as well. 2/3 of the Chinese containers go back to China empty. And even in the strong port regions of Antwerp and Rotterdam, what you then see is an increase in maritime transport, but a stagnation in manufacturing, right? So China is allowing you to generate all these TEUs in containers, but it's not allowing you to produce. So this is essentially a weakening of your port sectors. So for the government of Ukraine to be smart is not only to develop terminals to get in containers made in China, but it is also to surround its ports with manufacturing activity so that you can also export. Because otherwise you will also see this curve in Ukraine. That is more containers, but relatively less manufacturing, and that is not so conducive. Then, what does it mean for the bilateral partnership? How does China look at Ukraine? The beauty of working on China is that they're always very transparent. If you make a little effort, you just know in a few minutes what they are aiming at with regard to your country. So these kind of quotes and statements come from the Belt and Road Risk Assessment and the MOFCOM investment guidance. So that is official documents. What is the perception of Ukraine in these documents? Despite generous resources, the country lacks political capital. Not so positive. Ukraine's domestic political and legislative stability is poor. The fierce struggle of domestic political factions causes instability, corruption, backward infrastructure. So that's not me saying that, that's the Chinese government. So the view of Chinese government of this country is not so positive. And of course, when diplomats get to talk, they might tell you something different, but if you read what they write, it's a bit more nuanced. What's the focus of China? Agricultural raw materials first. Second, access to East and Central Europe for exports and exports of construction services. I think from a Chinese viewpoint, this is very evident. Why would you build manufacturing companies and factories in Ukraine if you can do it yourself, right? So China has, at this moment, only very limited interest in manufacturing. If it has interest in manufacturing, it is a little processing activity so as to be able to penetrate the European market, like the EU 28, the European internal market. And then you get situations as what you have in Cambodia nowadays, where you have quote-unquote Chinese factories with the only sort of value added is sewing in a little tag made in Cambodia. So they ship in the T-shirts, like made in China, but then to circumvent certain trade barriers, or to benefit from the preferential trade agreements that we have with Cambodia, as we have with Ukraine, they just sew in made in Cambodia, and they might sew in made in Ukraine, but significant manufacturing is not yet happening. The takeaway for me, and this is something that you should ram into every single decision maker, is Attracting Chinese investment cannot replace good economic policy. Not possible. Attracting Chinese investment can never, ever be a replacement for building your own future. And then the question is, of course, what's good policy? Like Mr. Pachenko said, we have to defend our economy. And I think that is true. But we have to defend our economy not to preserve the old industries that we have, right? We have to defend the industry in a way that we allow positive entrepreneurship, in a way that we allow entrepreneurs to do better, right? We don't want to preserve all steel factories per se. We want to build steel factories that emit less CO2, that pollute our environment less, that preferably also are able to reuse a lot of the steel so that we have to import less of the ores. So do we have to learn from China? Perhaps to some extent. But I think, in essence, what we have to do first is to go back to the basics. To go back to the basics of economic thinking and to reread the classics. To reread the classics. What is a marketplace about? What does it mean, economics, right? And then if you reread the classics, what comes across time and again is that the point of departure is us, right? The point of departure is not growth. The point of departure is not technology. The point of departure is not trade. The point of departure is us. So the thing that we have to consider first is, how do we want to shape our livelihood? How do we want to shape our future? What is the kind of work that we would like to do, and what do we like to leave to robots? So I think the core thing of economic policy is philosophy. How do we see ourselves as human beings? How do we see our future as employees and as entrepreneurs? Then from that, you define values. What is it that makes the Ukrainian citizens, turns Ukrainian citizens into a community of destiny, into a community that has a common destiny? From that, you decide and determine what's important. What do we think is critical, and what do we think is important to reward financially? And then you can start to think about productivity and growing. But growth as such doesn't mean anything. The main question underpinning economics is, what do you want to grow in? What are the kind of things that you really want to do better to have a good life? Then what does economic statecraft mean? I think in essence, economic statecraft starts with education. That is not just telling young people that they have to work very hard and that they should not dream, but just do as they are asked to do. I think the essence of education is to make youngsters believe in a better future. And this is something that China is gradually coming to grips with. Chinese education for decades was only about creating engineers, as many as possible. But guess what China added to its curriculum in the last few years? Philosophy, aesthetics. Why aesthetics? Because knowing what is beautiful is good for making more creative entrepreneurs, is good for inspiring people to use their imagination. Citizenship, also very important. Like, whatever you do, whether you do it as an employee or as an entrepreneur or as an official, the core should be to build a better society. And that is also, I think, a message that is given very forcefully in China's education. Secondly, learn people to consume. What is it to consume? What does that mean? How can you identify quality from junk? Critical. Also something that is gradually coming to Chinese school. Like in Chinese high schools nowadays, there are discussions across the board about durability. What's a good product? What does it mean make it made in China in the future? And then, of course, the government has to set standards, organize the marketplace, and elevate the playing field. It's only at that stage that economic power politics kicks in. First, you have to set the ambition for yourself, and then you have to defend your market. So if we want to go for entrepreneurship that builds quality things, that builds beautiful things and sustainable things, you have to organize your standards in such a way that if you want to make these kind of goods in Ukraine, that you are not being destroyed by false competition from China and other countries that basically screw up their environment for the sake of gaining some competition. And then in function of this, capacity building, R&D, IP, financial policy, entrepreneurship, and so forth. But you see that for me, when it comes to economic power politics, this whole stuff that we talk about the most also in this forum just comes at the bottom. It's a means. It's a means. The end is what is at the top of this curve. For me, progress is getting more productive in what is truly valuable. So if this is Maslow's pyramid, what economics is about is, of course, to be able to fill our basic needs, to continue to have food, nice houses, but also to have a society that is more based on respect, is more coherent, and also allows us to work towards self-actualization. And then a lot of it depends on us as individual citizens. We can watch and wait until the government basically do things for us, but ultimately we have certain power to shape the course of economics. On the one hand, I guess we all want this: happy life, being able to travel, good work, establish a family, nice house, and so forth. And I think that's decent, that's normal. But what we usually do with our money is to spend it in a way that we don't build the image that is on the left, but that basically pushes the capital to the kind of economic model that is on the right, right? An economic model not so much based on creativity and so forth, but mostly on the exploitation of people and also exploiting nature. So for me, the essence, and there I will conclude, the essence of economic statecraft is to organize the market, the domestic market, in a way that positive entrepreneurship is encouraged, that we reward entrepreneurs for working towards the values and the aspirations that we as human beings, as citizens in this case of Ukraine, hold dear and close to us. It starts with a conscious attempt of the government to put core values at the center of the economic debate. And then come the means. Then we have indeed to pursue a trade policy that discourages and sanctions unfair competition. Then we roll out an investment policy that does not allow trade partners to rob the country, but forces them to make stronger. Conditionalize on your own terms. So you want to have access to our farmland? Fine. We keep the ownership over the farmland. You can produce here, but we want you to add value to our commodities before you enter. Makes sense, I think. But also condition your own companies. Right? There's a lot of talk about oligarchs in Ukraine. You have them, I think, anywhere nowadays in the world. Strong government would do like many governments do in Asia. You force the corporate leaders to contribute to national development. You force them to invest in education. You force them to invest in infrastructure and not to get most of the billions out of the country on some account in Switzerland and then do some nice public diplomacy events and some charity to cover it all up. That's statecraft. Statecraft is believing in the inherent strength of the nation. Statecraft, I think, also is about connecting values and economic power. Statecraft, I think, in case of Ukraine, is also not assuming that Ukraine's future will be shaped and made in China or any other country, but believing in the fact that given some smart policy choices and allowing young people to be innovative and positive in their entrepreneurship, the future can really be shaped in Ukraine and also by Ukrainian citizens. That would be the main takeaway of what I had to share with you in my presentation, and then I think we can continue? There, right?
Yeah, there. Thank you, Jonathan. In fact, we don't have much time for continuing. I recommend colleagues to ask Jonathan somewhere in the halls or during the lunch.
We have 50 minutes, right? No?
Yes, no more than 50 minutes. Okay. So I think the questions would be the best way to continue.
I will be short in my answer.
Do you have questions? With the microphone, please, for translation.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask Jonathan about development of China. Could Chinese language could be global and RMB could be global currency in the future soon development?
Mandarin, of course, is spreading very fast, and China has a clear ambition to internationalize the renminbi, the currency. But of course, as you know, the condition of internationalizing a currency is that you run deficits. Right? The only way the US dollar got internationalized was because the US economy ran big deficits so as to make foreign suppliers use your currency. China is not there yet. What you have is currency swaps. But that's kind of an artificial way of internationalizing the currency. I think you will get there if China's domestic consumption grows stronger, and the Chinese leaders expect that to happen between 2025. And then indeed you will see the spreading of the Chinese currency. Also the value will go up, but not in the coming years.
Okay, thank you.
Next, please.
Thank you for speech, and as I know, China is going to improve internal consumption. And how do you think how long time they need to become as more competitive in consumption as developed countries like Europe, USA, and Japan? Thank you.
Well, as long as it takes for them to build a strong industry first. The calculation of the Chinese government is that they should avoid the middle income trap. And the analysis they make is that the middle income trap has basically crippled countries like Thailand and others because they shifted to consumption too fast. So ultimately what their leadership is up to is to continue to encourage high levels of investment in the next 5 to 10 years or so. So as to allow industries to continue to gain ground, also to shift production from basic industries to advanced industries, and then only you will see the fundamental rebalancing towards domestic consumption. So I think ultimately if China is successful in its industrialization policy, it will happen. If it fails, you get to see something different, but I don't think you should expect a significant rebalancing of China before 2020, 2025.
Okay, please, more questions. Then I have a question.
There's one over there, too.
May I ask?
The futurologist.
Yes, I have a question about China. If we judge on China upon its trade balance, how can we say that in other countries, European countries, EU countries, or Germany, for example, is the same situation and not better?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you, and I tend to say from time to time that the Germans are the Chinese of Europe. Inside the Eurozone, we have a very big problem with these German surpluses, and the German government is also not doing enough to promote domestic consumption. And I think in the end, this can destabilize and even derail the European Monetary Union. So I completely agree with you that we have to come to grips with that. Now, German surpluses inside the European Monetary Union should not be a problem if on the capital account, the money flows to countries like Italy, Greece, and so forth in a way that it boosts productivity in these countries. But usually the only thing that happens is that on the capital account, it flows to government debt, and it flows to the real estate market, more or less, but not to things that, that really make these countries more resilient and competitive. So definitely we have to address this problem with Germany, as we have to address it also with China. Like having a structure, let's say a short-term trade deficit can happen. Like there is nothing wrong with that. But it is the task of a government to watch that the overall trade balance is okay. And if you have a structural deficit with a country, you have to address that. And in any case, to make sure that if the country is making money out of your country, that some of the investment is coming back to productive industries. But in essence, like, it's really funny what you see in all these European countries, including Ukraine, is you allow the Chinese to gain billions out of your economy through its trade surplus, right? So that's basically predating on your internal demand. And then you go begging to Beijing, like, please come and invest. But essentially they are investing with your money. That's it. Via their policy banks, of course, but this is a kind of a financial transfer that I think doesn't make sense. Like, this is not smart statecraft. This is not smart economic policy. So reduce the trade deficit, keep that capital in the country as much as possible, and use it to boost your own productivity. Don't turn Ukraine into a debt dependency of China, because you become like Africa. I'm perhaps exaggerating, but Ukraine is going to have the same fate as the African countries. They will take the resources, they will do your port to get the resources out and the manufactured goods in, and then you will be addicted to their debt for the decades to come. And you guys, like all the youngsters in this room, you will be responsible for servicing that debt with an economy that is less competitive, right? So this is not something innocent. I think young Ukrainian citizens have an interest in at least following what is going on, and also make the leadership here responsible to it.
If they don't want to flee from the country. All right, last question, and then the last for me.
Today you say about the gap with the humanitarian education and technical and business education of Chinese. Tomorrow you said about the consumerism of Chinese and the gap with democracy and economic growth in China. But Western cultural products and new ways of education influent in Chinese society. How much time it takes for changes in consciousness of Chinese, and when the Chinese elite and head of party will change, or will be kicked off from the authority.
Yeah. Okay. So in essence, just to be let's say a bit simplistic, what the Chinese society predominantly is about is still peasants becoming factory workers, right? It's true. Still 45% of the Chinese population is rural. So China is still in the middle of that process. So what do these people want? They want to have a nice apartment somewhere in the city with a lot of flat screens on the wall, and a big car to be stuck in a traffic jam. That's I think what many Chinese want. Now, then if we have the new generations of urban Chinese, they want something different. They know that with their car they are stuck in the traffic. And they know that an apartment in a city is not so very healthy because of all the pollution, in spite of the 5 flat screens on the wall, so that it's not very good for children there to grow up. So they are gradually changing their expectations. They are, when we have again the pyramid of needs, they are moving higher up. They say, okay, we want to have our prosperity, but we also want to have healthy livelihood. We also want to have more leisure. We want to be able to travel freely. And we don't necessarily want to watch CCTV all the time. We might also want to tune in on BBC and other things. So they gradually want more freedom. I think it's a bit a paradoxical situation. So on the one hand, they want to have more individual freedom, but when it comes to politics, like most of the new urban middle class is still supportive of the Communist Party of China. Still. because they consider it to be the best way of preserving stability and growth and so forth and so forth. So in terms of political reform, the most people of the middle class are quite patient. I think where you have the frustration concentrated is amongst the poor. Labor migrants, farmers that are expropriated, factory workers that are not paid enough. There you have quite some disgruntlement. But higher up, it's okay. Chinese students, for instance, at university tend to be very supportive of the Communist Party of China. And it's not just because of the propaganda, but because by and large the country is making progress still. And if there are like problems with the work pressure, if there are problems with the lack of quality work, they blame it on capitalism. So the party is okay, but it's the capitalist system that's making us to work so hard and makes it difficult for us to have jobs that are gratifying.
Okay, I quit my questions. I would like to remind you that Jonathan Golslag is a representative of Brussels Free University. You have to understand that the system of academics in Europe includes dependent and independent universities. So this universities tend to be independent. And what Jonathan thinks of and what he analyzes is his independent thought, and whether we like it or we don't like it. For example, last year I was with admiration asking about China. Today he changed his ideas because he has much of information. So my recommendation is that you take his contacts, because he has a mission and he did not open his plans, but he has plans on leadership, and the audience which we have here, young audience, is I think for me it's some perspective for the future, that we need free thoughts of Europe, not as bureaucrats from European Commission, which we see every day here in Ukraine. So it gives me hope that Europe can change, and we can change together with Europe, and not to be dependent on China or any other countries. So let's applaud once again to Jonathan. And please share the contacts and be in touch with Free Brussels University and Jonathan Golslag.
Good idea.
Thank you.